Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a full-blown revolution in storytelling. We're going to look at how two major literary movements decided to just ditch fantasy and change all the rules, forcing art to finally get real.
So let's just dive right into that question, right? For literally centuries, stories were all about kings and gods and epic quests. But then, in the 19th century, something changed. The camera, so to speak, turned around, away from the castles and Mount Olympus, and pointed right at ordinary people, gritty cities, and the complicated, messy truth of everyday life.
So, how in the world did that happen? Well, here's our game plan. First, we'll see what kind of fantasy they were breaking away from. Then we'll get into what realism and naturalism actually are. After that, we'll meet the thinkers behind these huge ideas, and finally, we'll see how this whole thing went totally global.
All right, first things first. To really get realism, you have to know what came before it, and that was Romanticism. Think high emotion, idealized nature, and this deep fascination with imaginary worlds and faraway historical times. Basically anything but the here and now.
Yeah, realism wasn't just some new idea that popped up. It was a serious pushback. You had writers and artists looking around at this rapidly industrializing world with all its new problems and realities, and they felt that this romantic view just wasn't cutting it anymore. They wanted facts, not fantasy.
So how did this new commitment to the truth actually play out? Well, here's a good way to think about it. If Romanticism was like a beautiful stained glass window that made everything look kind of mythic and gorgeous, realism wanted to be a plain, clear mirror.
And that was its mission statement. I mean, it sounds simple, but it was absolutely revolutionary. The whole point was to show life as it was actually lived, without trying to pretty it up or teach some easy lesson. It was all about showing, not telling, and just letting the reader look at the unvarnished truth and decide for themselves.
And to be that mirror, writers needed a whole new toolkit. They got obsessed with extensive detail, almost like they were drawing up blueprints for the world. They wrote about contemporary life, the here and now. They started featuring characters from all social classes, not just the rich and powerful. And, this is crucial, they made them talk like real people, using everyday, colloquial language.
And you know, this didn't happen overnight. It was more like a huge wave that started building in the 1840s. Then, over the next few decades, it just took over, growing into this dominant force, from Flaubert in France all the way to Tolstoy in Russia.
Okay, but what happens when you take this burning desire for truth and you combine it with the discipline and methods of 19th century science? Well, that's when you get our next movement, naturalism. And honestly, it's basically realism on steroids.
Here's the key difference, and it's a big one. Think of realism as a photograph. It's capturing a moment exactly as it is. Naturalism, on the other hand, is more like a scientific experiment. It doesn't just show you what's happening, it tries to dissect the whole situation to explain precisely why it's happening using scientific ideas.
This framework really shows you how scientific it got. Naturalism ran on this idea of determinism, which is the belief that a person's character and destiny weren't really products of free will. Nope, they were determined by forces way beyond their control, mostly their genetics and their environment. This was a pretty radical idea, and it showed how the authority of science was starting to challenge older beliefs. Authors would literally put characters into situations, almost like a lab rat in a maze, just to see how their inescapable natures would play out.
Now, these really powerful and, let's be honest, kind of bleak ideas about who we are, they didn't just spring out of nowhere. They were built on a really solid intellectual foundation laid by some of the most influential thinkers of the time.
The key architect here was a French literary historian named Hippolyte Taine, and his big argument was that art wasn't some mysterious, divine thing. He believed it could be, and should be, studied with the same precision you'd use in a science lab.
Taine came up with this three-part formula to explain pretty much any work of literature. He said that to understand any writer, you had to analyze their race, and by that he meant their inherited traits, their milieu, which is their social and political environment, and the moment, meaning the specific historical period they were living in. For Taine, these three forces decided everything.
And then along comes the novelist Émile Zola. He's the guy who took Taine's theories out of the ivory tower and turned them into a practical, powerful guide, a manifesto really, for a whole new kind of fiction. He inspired an entire generation of writers to think of their novels as laboratories for the human condition.
And Zola's influence was just immense. It set off this seismic shift in literature. This wasn't just a little trend happening in France, it was about to become a full-on global movement.
The ripple effects were just huge. You see it here. In England, you've got writers like George Eliot and Thomas Hardy picking up these ideas. Over in America, authors like William Dean Howells and Theodore Dreiser started using them to really dig into the realities of American life. This drive to get real was going viral.
And what's really fascinating is that at the exact same time all this was happening in literature, technology and art were moving in perfect sync. Just as writers were striving for this new level of verbal accuracy, the invention of photography created a brand new standard for visual accuracy. The photograph really became the perfect metaphor for what realism was trying to do, just capture a direct, unfiltered piece of reality.
So you see, this isn't just some dusty chapter in a textbook. The legacy of realism and naturalism is absolutely everywhere. The next time you watch a gritty crime drama that explores how a character's tough upbringing made them who they are, or you read a novel about the quiet, ordinary struggles of a normal person, well, you are looking at the direct descendants of these movements, the ones that dared to believe that the most powerful stories of all weren't about gods or kings, but about us.